Hello there, folks, and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's Global Summit 12 presentation of Nancy Reagan, Archives, Letters, Memoirs, and Interviews, offering a new and revealing look at the former First Lady. I'm Ben Spigot, I'm the Vice President at the JES. In this program, which originally aired live on Thursday, May 20th, 2021, Global Summit Chairman Steve Scully interviews Karen Tumulty, Washington Post columnist and author of The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, about her best-selling book on the former First Lady. Before we get to the program, I'd like to thank all of our event sponsors: Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLN Public Media, and the American Tapestry Project, and our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And I'd like to remind you that you can access additional programs to stream on demand at jeserie.org, where you'll also find a wide range of publications, from reports, essays, timely writings, and more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with all JES content. And now, here's Nancy Reagan, Archives, Letters, Memoirs, and Interviews, offering a new and revealing look at the former First Lady.
Thank you. I am ecstatic to introduce Karen Tumulty. Now, she was in Erie during a snowstorm, and I swore to her that it really doesn't snow that often in Erie, Pennsylvania, but she caught up in what we know is the case in Northwest Pennsylvania. But she not only is a superb journalist and a mentor to so many, but she is a dear friend and somebody that has really inspired so many journalists. She has written countless cover stories for Time Magazine. She's written for the LA Times, Time Magazine, written for the Washington Post, and is now a columnist. She also sat down with more than 400 people to really gather the insights into this amazing book on Nancy Reagan, including with former Secretary of State George Schultz, who I had the chance to sit down with at the age of 98 and a half. And so we'll get some insights from Karen Tumulty on what that was like, one of the key advisors to Ronald Reagan during his 8 years in the White House. Her book came out just a month ago, and it has received praise globally because of the depth and breadth of its research, but also giving a different perspective on the former First Lady, her life in politics, her career in acting, and the tragedy of the Alzheimer's in the last 10 years of Ronald Reagan's life. And so with that, let me welcome Karen Tumulty virtually to the residents of Northwest Pennsylvania and those watching outside of Pennsylvania. We had many viewers yesterday watching around the country. Karen, thanks for being with us.
Oh, Steve, thank you so much for having me. I just wish we could be doing this in person again. It is really such an honor for me, a first-time author, to be included in such a distinguished lineup as you guys have put together.
And that surprised me when you sat down with Susan Swain on Q&A, because this was your first book. What a mammoth project.
I did not realize it was going to be a mammoth project when Simon Schuster actually came to me a few months after Nancy Reagan died in 2016. And they said, we'd like a biography on her. Do you want to do it? And I'd always thought I wanted to write a book, but I was a little scared of writing a book. And she struck me as sort of interesting. What I didn't know was that it was going to take me 4.5 years. And I also didn't know at the time, really didn't know until I was probably 2 years into the research, how completely complex of a person she was, but also how substantial of a figure she was. I found myself realizing that if I could pull this book off the way I wanted to, that it would be not just a biography of a first lady, not just a tale of a great love story, but really, I hoped, a new window into the rise of one of the most consequential figures in the 20th century, a new way of looking at the entire Reagan presidency, and also in looking at how Ronald Reagan's legacy was shaped. Because in the years after the White House, when he becomes incapacitated by Alzheimer's, that job really falls on Nancy Reagan.
What you do so well in this book is that you take us there. I mean, you paint very vivid pictures, so many different memories, from the assassination attempt to Ronald Reagan's last public appearance in Washington, D.C., to the loss in New Hampshire in 1976. And I guess you're in the room. We want to talk about all of that, but I want to ask you first about the process of writing this book, the interviews you did, the other biographies that you read, the diaries, the other firsthand sources? Because over the years we had the chance to interact, and you would often regale stories about what you were coming across next. So share that, if you would, with the Erie audience.
Sure. Again, because this book wasn't my idea, I didn't come to it with a book proposal or an outline or really a very clear sense of how you go about writing a book. I just started digging everywhere I could. I spent weeks and weeks and weeks at the Reagan Library. One of the things I learned, by the way, is that when you do research in a presidential library, there is the stuff they have to show you because the National Archives has deemed it part of the public record. But then there's all the private stuff that, it takes a lot of negotiation. And it was really in the foundation, little by little by little, letting me see some of the private stuff. I came across really important handwritten letters by Ronald Reagan that had never seen the light of day, her mother's diary, all sorts of things. I interviewed absolutely everybody I could who was still alive. So, one of my earliest interviews was George Schultz, who at that point was a spring chicken of 97. And what I really came away from that, and it's the opening scene in the book, was how important her role was in the thawing of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. I did not imagine when I started this that I would be writing several chapters on foreign policy. I, again, interviewed everybody I could find who knew them, who could explain what the era was around them. It turned out there were a lot of oral histories by people who were no longer among us. And just what I didn't realize going in was how many tell-all books had been written by insiders in the Reagan administration. So I just read absolutely everything I could.
Erie knows a thing or two about snow and winter storms. They can handle the storm. But in the opening chapter of your book, you talk about that February 1982 storm here in Washington that paralyzed the city. Take it from there.
Sure. It's actually February 1983. And
83, yeah.
It's one of the biggest blizzards of the 20th century. And Washington is not great about snow. So the city is paralyzed. George Schultz, kind of new in his job as Secretary of State. He's only had it for 7 months, barely beat the snow as he was coming back from China. And on Saturday afternoon, he gets a call as the city's digging out from Nancy Reagan. And she says, why don't you and your wife come over for dinner tonight? It'll just be the four of us. Now, mind you, he's new in his job. He doesn't even know the Reagans all that well. So they go over and the two couples are having what George Schultz thinks is a social evening. And then all of a sudden, both Reagans start pounding him with questions about the Chinese. What do they like? Do they have a sense of humor? Do they have a bottom line? And from there, Ronald Reagan begins to talk about the Soviet Union and his own ideas for engaging them. Now, Schultz at that point, he knows Ronald Reagan as someone who has had decades of anti-communist rhetoric, who has stacked his administration with hardliners who believed there could never be any such thing as a working relationship with Moscow, who is presiding over the biggest peacetime military buildup in history. And Schultz says it suddenly dawns on him, this man has never had a conversation with a big time communist leader, and he is dying to. He really believes in his own skills as a negotiator. And at the same time, it dawns on Schultz, that is the whole reason that Nancy Reagan set up this dinner. She wanted to get Schultz one-on-one with her husband so that he could understand something about Ronald Reagan that had the potential to change history. The other thing that George Schultz realizes in that moment is that he has found an incredibly powerful ally in this first lady who understands her husband as no one else does, and who is, in fact, the only person in the world to whom Ronald Reagan is truly close. And over the coming years, there would be many, many battles between Schultz and some of the hardliners in the administration. And Nancy Reagan is a very crucial ally in those. In fact, Nancy Reagan is one of the reasons that Ronald Reagan went through a half dozen national security advisors.
So let's go back to the earlier years. Ronald Reagan is an actor. He meets Nancy Davis. His career begins to wane. There is an eerie connection with Ronald Reagan because General Electric had a large locomotive plant. One of the side stories, my dad worked for that company and had the chance to have a dinner with Ronald Reagan. There were about 100 people there, but early in the 1960s, the fading governor, before he rose to prominence in 1964 and then becomes a candidate for governor in 1966. Just walk us through that time period of how Nancy Reagan helped Ronald Reagan shift from an actor, Screen Actors Guild, GE spokesperson, to governor of California.
You know, when these two meet in 1949 on a supposedly blind date, but what I discovered in my research was Nancy Reagan had her eye on him for quite a while and was trying to come up with all kinds of ways for their paths to cross. You're right, his career as an actor is coming to an end. His first wife, Jane Wyman, has essentially gotten bored with him and walked out of the marriage. He shows up for the date, literally a broken man. He's broken his leg in 6 different places and had standing on crutches because he's been in traction for 2 months. It is truly the low point of his life. And he would later say, if Nancy Davis hadn't come along when she did, I would have lost my soul. But they get married he's not that easy to pin down. He's, as he would later say, his heart was in a deep freeze. When they get married, you know, his career scraping bottom, her career at MGM, which never really took her very far. She's being let out of her contract. They are going through some very lean Hollywood years, to the point where Ronald Reagan has to take the most humiliating gig of his life. He MCs a floor show in Las Vegas. And on the way back, he tells Nancy, he says, I hope I never fall this low again. But it is shortly after that General Electric offers him this deal where they are going to make him the host of a television show, General Electric Theater. Reagan never thought he would do TV. He said, why would anybody do TV? Nobody's going to want to pay to see you in the movies if they can see you at home for free. But he's desperate enough to do it. The show takes off. It is a huge hit. But part of the deal is he is to travel the country and speak to tens of thousands of General Electric employees at their, plants across the country. And it is really, both he and Nancy would later say, it is really in those days that he gets his feel for average Americans, their frustrations, their concerns. These are the people who would later become known as the Reagan Democrats, the traditional Democrats who cross party lines to vote for Ronald Reagan. And it is really as he is traveling the country, walking plant floors, meeting with people, listening to them, that he develops the feel for politics that would later, take him to the governorship of California and to 2 terms as president. I mean, people forget, he won 49 states in 1984. I mean, imagine any politician today who could win 49 states.
And of course, part of that was in Erie at the GE plant. In fact, he campaigned in 1980 and again in 1984, coming back to go after those Reagan Democrats. So he leaves the governor's mansion in 1975, a young guy by the name of Jerry Brown, his successor, the father of Edmund G. Pat Brown. And he's trying to figure out what he's going to do next. You had Watergate, Nixon is forced out, the only appointed president, and he decides to challenge Gerald Ford, a sitting Republican president. What was Nancy Reagan's role in that?
She was kind of reluctant, but once he decided this was what he was going to do, she was all aboard. And she would later say that the 1976 campaign, where her husband comes very, very close to knocking off a sitting president for the Republican nomination, was the campaign, out of all the ones he ran, the big one that he lost is the one that stands out in her memory the most, because there are so many what ifs in this campaign. You know, if only we'd stayed in New Hampshire a day longer, if only we'd had money enough to go into these Midwestern states. And she actually loses faith at one point when he's had a string of losses against Ford. This is becoming this humiliating endeavor. But she is crucial to something very important that happens in North Carolina, which is a decision. They're running out of money. They are so out of money with this campaign that, like, the hotels are making them pay in advance. But they take what little money they have, and Nancy Reagan is instrumental in this. In North Carolina, they put up a 30-minute video across the state, which is just Ronald Reagan talking to the camera. In the era of 30-second and 60-second political spots, this goes against every bit of conventional wisdom. But it completely turns things around in North Carolina. And it does set Ronald Reagan on the path to, again, where he comes pretty darn close to knocking off Ford and they go into the convention and really duke it out there for the final delegates.
One of the stories I love in the book, she's traveling to a small town in North Carolina. The ladies are thrilled to have her, and she basically said, "I just don't care. I don't want to be here." Tell that story.
It's, again, they're in their lean years. She's traveling with an aide named Nancy Reynolds, who was the person who told me this story. And these women, these homemakers mostly, had just knocked themselves out, just, baking and cooking for days. And she's sort of had it with this whole campaign, and she's really quite frosty and rude to them, which, by the way, she was quite capable of being. And on their little plane hop back, Nancy Reynolds isn't even speaking to her. And finally, Nancy Reagan says, "What's the matter with you?" And she says, "You were incredibly rude." And she was just, "I'm just not in the mood for this." And again, this is when she wants out of this campaign. But the important thing is, when her husband wins North Carolina and then almost wins the nomination, she realizes that she had sort of betrayed him with that, she was never again not going to believe in him. And that really does become instrumental in his rise. She has a much better instinct about the people around him than he does. He's very non-confrontational. She is willing to mow down anybody who she believes is not serving him well. She's a woman who has a lot of flaws, a lot of demons. My book does not flinch from any of those. But as James Baker, their first White House chief of staff, who, by the way, got that job because of Nancy Reagan, told me, he said, she had incredible radar. In fact, her radar was better than his.
Another great part of the book, and I'm trying to chronicle from the early years to the White House, and we'll get to the White House in a moment, but that period after Reagan loses the nomination to Gerald Ford, Ford narrowly loses the election to Jimmy Carter. They go back to California. She's happy. Her social life, as you point out in the book, is probably better than ever with friends. And they're trying to figure out Reagan's path to 1980. Reagan is doing radio commentary, trying to figure out how he can play a role in the Republican Party and then gain a foothold in 1980. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, but he is really torn over whether to make a second run for the presidency. And as a number of people told me, including Ed Rollins, who was their 1984 campaign manager, Reagan would later say that he probably wouldn't have run in 1980 had it not been for his wife going, "This is your moment." And so she is very, very much, and then his campaign at one point in New Hampshire almost falls apart. And it is Nancy Reagan who engineers the shakeup, the firing of his campaign manager. Although, ironically enough, in 1984, she doesn't want him to run for re-election. He's coming out of this terrible recession where his numbers have been kind of underwater for a while. She's tormented and traumatized by the assassination attempt. She is afraid for his safety, afraid that there's still somebody out there trying to, kind of finish off what John Hinckley started. So she's begging him not to run in 1984, but he is the one who says, "Nope, I've got to do it."
I want to ask you about the selection of this cover, this photo for your book. You had a lot to choose from. Clearly in the early years. Why this one?
So when Simon and Schuster showed me that photo that they wanted to put on the cover, I'd never seen it before. That appears to be her during probably the California First Lady years. What I love about that photo is, number one, it signals to the reader that this is a serious book. This is not a gossipy book. She's not wearing red. The red is in the background, which, her love of the color red is sort of a cliche. And also, she's not dressed like a fashionista. She's not wearing those shoulder pads out to here from the 1980s and stuff that you see really on so many other images of her, and, and certainly of the book covers of other books that have written about her. So I just really thought it was kind of perfect for what the book was trying to achieve. And again, that it is to explain the significance of a figure that was really kind of written off in her own time. And I think that most Americans had kind of made up their minds 40 years ago, whether they admired her or not. And she was truly one of our more controversial first ladies. A lot of these problems, by the way, she brought on herself.
March 1981, Ronald Reagan giving a speech at the Washington Hilton. He is shot as he's departing the Hilton. Where was Nancy Reagan, and how did the events unfold after that?
So she had a couple of events in the morning. She would later say, though, she excused herself from a luncheon that she was supposed to be at because she just kind of felt like she needed to get home. So she is meeting in the White House solarium with the chief usher and the decorator who's involved in a big renovation project. And suddenly the head of her Secret Service detail shows up and he summons her to come over and talk to him. And he tells her that there has been a shooting at the hotel where the president was giving this speech. But he says, "Don't worry, he's fine. He's unharmed. He's just going to the hospital." And she's, "Well, why is he going to the hospital if he's unharmed?" He said, "Well, I don't know why, but," and at that point, the Secret Service has radioed the White House that, Rawhide is fine, his code name. Nancy Reagan gets up, starts heading for the elevator. She says, "I'm getting to that hospital. And if I have to walk, I'm going to go there." So they summon a car for her. She gets stuck in traffic. By the time she gets to the hospital, Michael Deaver meets her coming in and says that not only has the president been shot, but that they can't find the bullet. And I then try to walk the reader through that day in parts, minute by minute by minute, because as we now know, Ronald Reagan came much closer to death than the country was allowed to know at the time. And her trauma over that really has an anxious personality going back to reasons I explained in her childhood, but her trauma over that, the anxiety that leaves her with, really explains so much else about her role as First Lady, her life, the reason she does some really wacky things like insisting that the president's schedule be run by an astrologer. It is really this fear of abandonment and anxiety that doesn't lift, that really determines a lot of what happens in the book from there on out.
And you tie that into Nancy Reagan's own childhood. Can you explain?
So Nancy Reagan was born Anne Frances Robbins in 1921, although for many decades she would say it was 1923. So she would be having her 100th birthday on July 6th this summer. She was born into a bad match between a very ambitious actress and a not very successful car salesman. Their marriage is effectively over by the time this very inconveniently timed baby arrives. Her mother, a single mother, is not ready to interrupt her career or her busy social life. So as soon as this baby, Nancy Robbins, is out of diapers, her mother essentially abandons her with relatives. So Nancy Robbins spends the next 6 years of her childhood just yearning for this absent mother. Eventually, her mother, Edith Luckett, decides she's marrying a doctor in Chicago. She comes, she retrieves her daughter. Even then, Nancy is something of an outsider in this house. She adores her stepfather, but she has to arrange her own adoption herself when she's in her teens. And as her son, Ron, explained to me, as other people explained to me, those years in which she was abandoned, those years when she was such a lonely child wishing for a normal family, really left her again with this shadow on her spirit, this anxiety that never lifts, and this sense that no matter how good things get, that life is a trap door, that the whole bottom could fall out at any moment. And certainly that does seem to be confirmed 2 months into her husband's presidency, when she almost loses him. And ultimately, shortly after his presidency, when he is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he is on a journey where she cannot follow him.
Another moment in the Reagan presidency, the second term, Reagan wins 49 out of 50 states. Only Minnesota and DC does Reagan lose. And yet, as we all know, second terms are often fraught with scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal and the role of then White House Chief of Staff Don Regan, who would switch jobs with James Baker, who had been previously the Treasury Secretary. James Baker is now Treasury Secretary. He becomes White House Chief of Staff, but many people called him the Prime Minister. And you covered the White House during that time, didn't you?
I was mostly covering the Hill at that time, but I was in Washington, and I did cover the Iran-Contra scandal on the Hill. I was in every minute of those hearings. And I think that my Iran-Contra chapter, where I really have a lot of new information, is in some ways the heart of the book, because people may not remember what this was all about, but essentially the Reagan administration had been selling arms to the government of Iran, our country's enemy, in exchange as essentially ransom payments to free US citizens who were being held hostage in the Middle East. And then the money was being illegally diverted to the Contra forces who were fighting against the Sandinista leftist government in Nicaragua. It's a big, big mess. But Nancy Reagan almost single-handedly runs the rescue effort from the White House. And again, I have this thoroughly documented. It causes great strain on the Reagan's marriage because she is just pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. She's telling her husband he's got to shake up her non-confrontational husband. He's got to shake up the entire White House staff, starting with firing his very autocratic chief of staff, who she believes let this happen. Ultimately, she wins that one, but at least as important, maybe more important, she has to convince her very stubborn husband that he is going to have to admit to the country and admit to himself that what he had done was traded arms for hostages. He ultimately gives a nationally televised speech that I think a lot of people would say even today helped save his presidency. Nancy does not trust anyone in the West Wing to write this, as she does on several other occasions. She goes out and gets her own outside speechwriter to craft this nationally televised address. And, you know, Reagan's approval rating goes up 9 points in the polls overnight. The country had really lost their faith that they could trust this guy to be straight with them. And, you know, these actions, this speech really helps turn it around. In the next morning's paper, R.W. Apple says it is the most consequential mea culpa since Kennedy's Bay of Pigs speech.
And what is fascinating is that Nancy Reagan did not have a West Wing office, but clearly, as you write in the book, her presence was felt at every turn. And oh, by the way, if you're the chief of staff, don't ever hang up on the first lady.
That's right. But Ed Rollins told me at one point, trying to tell Regan, you are making a big, big mistake here, when he, you know, at one point, Don Regan, the chief of staff, tells the first lady, you know, if you have anything you want to tell me, just give it to one of my subordinates. And she's going, you know, Don, I really don't see any need for an intermediary. She's relentless in trying to get rid of him. He, in his own book, writes that sometimes he would pick up the phone and hear her voice on the other end of the line saying, oh, Don, are you still here? But, you know, ultimately, she wins that battle. She wins a lot of other battles.
As you know, Susan Page was with us last night praising your book. I asked her the same question I'm going to ask you, the relationship. And this is one of the questions from one of our viewers in Erie saying, what was the relationship like between Barbara Bush and Nancy Reagan?
They completely despised each other. And I would ask this question over and over and over again of people, James Baker and others who were close to everybody. The Reagans never invited the Bushes to visit the family quarters, which, by the way, people were surprised when Joe Biden said that was also the case with the Obamas. But anyway, I think that part of their animosity went back to the 1980 campaign, the very bitter primary race between Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. I think Barbara Bush never let Nancy Reagan forget whose husband she thought should have been in the Oval Office, as opposed to going to the funerals of foreign leaders. But I think there was also a lot about Barbara Bush that really triggered Nancy Reagan's insecurities. Nancy Reagan was constantly being criticized for her expensive wardrobe. Barbara Bush also had a closet full of designer clothes, but she was bathed in glowing coverage. She was sort of seen as America's grandmother. Barbara Bush had a lineage that went back to the Mayflower. The Reagans were viewed as these, you know, Aravis from Hollywood. And also there was the fact that the Reagan family, and again, I go into great detail in this book, was just deeply, deeply, deeply dysfunctional. The Reagans had 4 children, 2 from his first marriage, 2 from their second marriage. They were not good parents. I mean, Nancy Reagan herself would acknowledge, all I ever wanted, she said, was to be a good wife and mother. I guess I was better at one than the other. But so where the Bushes are surrounded by this tight-knit, very functional, loving family, you know, the Reagan kids are just sort of all off pursuing their own paths in life.
Because I know Ron Reagan said that Nancy and Ron Reagan had a love affair. The problem is there wasn't room for anyone else.
And in fact, Patty Davis, their daughter, said that at Nancy's funeral. Ron Reagan would say, the one thing my mother was really, really good at was loving. But Patty would say they were so tightly bound. And again, mind you, Ronald Reagan he did not have friends. I mean, his wife was truly the only person he was close to. And Patty Davis even said at her mother's funeral, they were so tightly bound. They were a complete circle unto themselves. And the rest of us just floated around outside of it.
So a follow-up from this other question, referring to Raisa Gorbachev. Obviously, the two do not get along. And the question is, was there a contemporary first lady in the world that Nancy Reagan got along with or had a closer relationship with?
You know, who I would pick is not a first lady. I would pick Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan viewed Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, as his ideological soulmate. And as in his final years, she had promised him that she was going to give a eulogy at his funeral. In fact, Margaret Thatcher would travel with a black dress in her suitcase in case she might have to suddenly be called back to do this duty that she had promised Ronald Reagan. But by the time Ronald Reagan dies in 2004, she herself has been incapacitated by strokes and a number of health issues. And she's afraid that she is not going to be able to be up to standing up and giving a speech live. So she had, in the spring before he died, recorded a videotaped tribute to him. She'd be there in the church in person, but the speech would be on video. Anyway, so you fast forward to Reagan's death, and they're planning the funeral at the National Cathedral, and they bring up this video, and the tightly wound people at the National Cathedral say, no, can't do that. This is a religious service. We cannot have videos. At which point, Fred Ryan, who had been Reagan's post-presidential chief of staff, said, this is the way Nancy Reagan wants it. And if you don't play this video, we're taking this down the street to National Presbyterian. So the people at the National Cathedral relented. And honestly, if you watch the funeral, it doesn't really make any difference, the televised funeral.
And of course, Fred Ryan is now your boss.
Where he is the publisher of the Washington Post.
Before we get to Ronald Reagan's death, let's talk about the final years. As I said before we got started, on February 3rd, 1994, just as kind of a Forrest Gump moment, C-SPAN was the pool for an event that Reagan was giving a speech for the Republican National Committee. It was ostensibly a birthday celebration put together by the then chairman, Haley Barbour. It was the last public appearance in Washington. I actually had the chance to see Ronald Reagan behind the stage, and I knew right then that something wasn't quite right because he wasn't robust. He was literally being carried behind the stage to the car that was waiting to take him back to the airport. And when he arrived beforehand, he just seemed kind of puzzled. And there weren't a lot of Secret Service, but there were enough. So, in post-presidencies, it's not like it's the president. And I just remember vividly, and I had just started at C-SPAN, but that was just one of those moments. I just happened to be there. You talk about that day, that evening here in Washington. So please tell the story about what you found out.
Well, so John Hutton, who had been White House physician for Reagan, first of all, I lay out as carefully and dispassionately as I could, because people are going to forever, I think, debate when exactly the Alzheimer's symptoms showed up. So, but that night, John Hutton, who had been White House physician, notices that as Reagan takes the stage, and Margaret Thatcher is there for this event as well, there is just a split second where he doesn't seem to know his place. There's a teleprompter in front of him. He's got notes in his hands. He seems lost. But then all of a sudden, he's fine again. And he gives his speech. People are cheering. Some people are crying. He seems as good as ever. But that night, Hutton goes back to the Reagan's hotel room with them. Reagan goes in first, flips on the light and goes, wait a minute, I need to stop here for a second. I'm not really sure where I am. At which point Nancy grabs Hutton's arm and says, John, this is happening even at home. Mm-hmm. And that really it was his last public, the great communicator. This was the last big speech he would give in public. By Nixon's funeral, which happens later that year, it's pretty clear, just looking at him, that something is wrong. And then finally, later that year, the Reagans, he announces that he's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and does it in a handwritten letter to the country. And it is an incredibly graceful letter. He had actually asked to have it typed up. And when Fred Ryan saw it, he said, no, we are putting this out in your handwriting so the country can know these are your thoughts.
So 2 self-serving promotions. That speech is in the C-SPAN video library, so do check it out. But also a Brian Lamb interview with Nancy Reagan in 1999 as Brian is asking the former First Lady about that letter. And at this point, it had been 5 years with Nancy Reagan dealing with Alzheimer's, as she called it, the long goodbye. Talk about that.
His decline is pretty steep. It's a series of like downward plateaus. By 1999, Brian Lamb, being the lovely, gentle, yet persistent and direct questioner he is, just keeps pressing her on this. Finally, he says, can you still have a conversation with him that makes any sense? And she says no. So she becomes both his physical caretaker, the guardian of his dignity, but she also becomes the guardian of his legacy. And you really see her put a lot into the building of the library. She does some things that I think are just incredibly important. On the one hand, she's mistrustful of people on the right who would appropriate Ronald Reagan's name and his image for whatever purposes that they wanted. She, in fact, opposes an effort by the Republicans in Congress to bump FDR off the dime and put Reagan's profile on instead. But she also knows that there are still a large segment of the sort of liberal intelligentsia who agree with Clark Clifford's description of Ronald Reagan as an amiable dunce. So in his final years, and even in the years after Reagan dies, Nancy Reagan engineers the publication of his handwritten White House diaries so that people can read day by day by day. Very few presidents, by the way, have kept real-time diaries. So people can read his thoughts day by day by day. She arranges for the publication of 50 years worth of his letters, handwritten, again, not just to world leaders, but to people like a woman who had been the president of one of his fan clubs when he was an actor with whom he stayed in touch for decades. And she also, they come across almost accidentally at the library, handwritten speeches that he had been giving around the country before he runs for president in 1980. And really in those speeches, you can see that his entire philosophy of governing. So this idea that somehow Ronald Reagan was just an actor reading lines that somebody else wrote for him, I think she knows that the most powerful evidence to the contrary would be his own words in his own handwriting.
Based on 4 years of research, the diaries, the archives, 400 interviews, if you had the chance to sit down with Nancy Reagan today, what questions are unanswered?
What I would love to know is how a woman who was so incredibly shrewd about her husband's image and, his strengths and weaknesses could have been so clueless about her own. She was a controversial first lady because she made a lot of mistakes. She redecorated the White House and had bought $1,000 a place setting china for the White House with private donations, not taxpayer money, but in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression. You know, people are worried about keeping food on their plates, and she's buying all this stuff. She's borrowing designer clothes and not returning them. I mean, she developed an image as this kind of haughty, shallow, acquisitive socialite. And she really doesn't turn it around until her husband, you know, at least the third year of her husband's presidency. And so I would love to know, again, how she could have been, this to me was the great conundrum of Nancy Reagan.
And yet she did turn it around a little bit at the gridiron dinner.
She does. She does.
Close.
This is the gridiron dinner is this white tie event in Washington. It's put on. I'm a gridiron member, so it's a club of journalists that, at least in its own mind, is very prestigious. Mm-hmm. But they do this night of skits and dinner, and so this is right in the middle of one of the controversies where people have found out she's borrowing designer clothes and not returning them. So of course the club is going to do a funny song about it. So they did a song where they had an actress get up and sing something to the old Fanny Brice song, Secondhand Rose, but this is Secondhand Clothes. And Nancy Reagan comes to them with the idea that she wants to turn the tables. Doesn't even tell her husband about this, but the actress finishes her song, and then suddenly on stage steps this tiny figure in the most garish, outlandish outfit they could find. Big feathered hat, feather boa, rain boots, just tacky. And it takes everybody a second to realize they are looking at the First Lady. And she sings her own version of the song, and it's very self-deprecating. To Secondhand Clothes is the song is all about her secondhand clothes. The final line is, and I sure hope Ed Meese sews. And it really does begin to crack her image as an ice queen. And her husband would get up to give his speech that evening, and he said, "Well, I arrived here as a happy husband, and I'm leaving as a stage door Johnny."
Was there an aha moment in all of the research? Because it had to be just, I don't want to use the term voyeuristic, but you had the chance to really look into the inner life of the president and the first lady with diaries and the letters that Ronald Reagan, the love letters that he wrote, Nancy Reagan. Was there a moment you thought, oh my gosh, this is just a treasure trove that really, really struck you? And there had to be a few, but was there one in particular?
There really wasn't. I mean, it was just like, it took me, there was like a thread to weave in here and a thread to weave in there. And it really took me a couple of years before I realized that this was a figure of actual significance. She affected policy, and that there was a story to tell here that really hadn't been told before. And the other thing that I had to do, there were a lot of people who I just had to keep going back to over and over and over again, and kind of building up their confidence that I was going to tell this story straight. And so finally, you know, a number of people really opened up to me. But 2 years in, I wasn't even sure what kind of book this was going to be.
And part of that was her own addiction, which you write about in great detail.
Yeah, ironically enough, the First Lady whose signature cause was going around and telling the country to just say no, was herself seriously addicted to prescription medication, as, by the way, a lot of women of her generation was. But her addiction, which again becomes quite serious in her anxiety after the assassination attempt was serious enough to worry not one, but two White House physicians. And I document this. I'm very clear on who my sources are there. It continues throughout her life. It was how she coped with things.
And then at what point did you say, the book is done, I'm finished, I have everything I need to finalize the book, which is a big challenge for any authors.
Probably a year and a half ago. I knew what the book was going to say, but getting it all written. And of course, when we were all sent home from our office in March of 2020, I thought, well, we'll be home a couple of weeks. I can get some writing done. I finally turned in, as we at the Washington Post were all sort of stuck at home and working remotely. I think I finally turned in the manuscript probably last fall at some point. And then you begin this excruciating process of going back and forth on the editing.
And let's conclude with her death. She was 94 years old. By the way, why did she always say 1923 instead of 21? Was that just an acting thing?
Well, so when she went to Hollywood, and by the way, her screen test was set up by Spencer Tracy, another really fun story in the book. When she goes to Hollywood, it's 1949, so she would have been 27. But the studio shaves 2 years off of her age because they feel like 25 is much more of an ingenue than 27. And she just went with it right through her biographies when she gets to the White House. Although she was a piker, her mother shaved 8 years off her age. And that goes right through to her obituaries. And at one point, Ron Reagan, Nancy Reagan's son, says to me, "Have you ever figured out how old my grandmother was?"
So her last year, I saw Nancy Reagan at the Reagan Library. Denny Hastert was Speaker of the House. And what struck me is she was, I remember seeing Nancy Reagan. She was never a tall person, but she just seemed very sturdy. She was hunched over. She had a walker. It was really a sad sight. I want to say it was 1999, separate from the Brian Lamb interview. But in her last year in her life, she really did struggle. So talk a little, because you chronicle that in the book.
Yeah, she died in 2016. So I think you probably saw her later than that. But
yes, you're right. You're right.
The end of her life is very, very lonely. All of her friends are either gone or incapacitated. Her love of her life is gone. She is struggling from many, many health ailments, including glaucoma. And it is a very sad, lonely time. And she really, it is the fear that had shaped her whole life, which is the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being left alone.
Would Ronald Reagan have been president without Nancy Reagan?
According to everybody I talked to, Stuart Spencer, who was his first campaign manager and closest political advisor, James Baker, no. That he uniquely needed someone like Nancy Reagan to be the guardian, to be the protector, to be the one who always, always watched his back.
And a final question, because you talked to her two biological children. She had two adopted, Michael and...
Actually, Patty did not talk to me. I talked to Ron, and I talked to her son-in-law, Dennis Ravel, and I talked to her brother, who, by the way, has just himself recently died.
Which I said. So what did Ron Reagan tell you about his mom that surprised you?
He was very, very, and by the way, so Patty and Michael, the other two children, Maureen died a while back, had themselves written a series of books that were incredibly raw, incredibly candid. So I do give them voice in my book through their own writings. But Ron Reagan was just very clear-eyed about his mother's strengths, his mother's weaknesses, and mostly how badly his father needed his mother, how their strengths and weaknesses just really interlocked and, made them whole and made them so much more that this couple, 1 + 1 was so much more than 2 with the Reagans.
Karen Tumulty, the book is called The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. I hope you have a second book in you.
I still right now feel like I'm in the labor and delivery room. So,
and you got to share the story about Slippery Rock before we let you go, because the audience might find that of interest.
So I was so excited the first time I went to Erie a couple of years ago, because I see this road sign that says Slippery Rock. I'm a graduate of the University of Texas. And when I was in college, we would have these gigantic football games. All the way through the game, they would keep announcing what the score was for Slippery Rock, and everybody would just go crazy. It was this kind of weird cult thing. So the idea that when I come to Erie next time, I'm not driving past Slippery Rock. I am going to go see Slippery Rock.
Karen Tumulty, columnist for the Washington Post, award-winning journalist, and of course her book, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, on behalf of the Jefferson Education Society. Thank you for being with us. We will have you back in Erie, and we appreciate your time tonight. What a great project. What a great book. It deserves all the accolades. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been my honor.
Absolutely. To our guest tonight, Miss Karen Tumulty, the author of The Triumph of Nancy Reagan and columnist at the Washington Post. Thank you for sharing your insights and knowledge with us and joining us here for this conversation. We can't wait to get you back in Erie and give you a tour of Slippery Rock University. Okay. And a big thanks, of course, goes to Mr. Steve Scully, the chairman of the JES's Global Summit Speaker Series, for moderating tonight's lively, thought-provoking, fun, and tender, deep conversation about the former First Lady. And thanks, of course, goes out to the entire JES team under the leadership of our president, Dr. Fergie Ferrati, and to the JES Board of Trustees under the leadership of our chairwoman, Joyce Savacchio, and to all of our event sponsors, Erie Insurance, Erie News Now, the Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority, WQLN Public Media, the American Tapestry Project, and to our Global Summit event partner, the City Club of Cleveland. And of course, to all of you watching along at home, thank you for tuning in. These programs and discussion and the exchange of information and ideas would not be possible without you. Folks, for more information about the JES, including how to register for additional Global Summit events, please visit jeserie.org. There you're also going to find details on how to purchase The Triumph of Nancy Reagan, along with videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand and publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as information about other JES initiatives such as our Civic Leadership Academy and Ramey Fellows program. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spigen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.